In this real-side experience, I would begin in my house. The house representing the personal, created self on the real side. I had a little container of pills that I intended to consume. To the personal self, these seemed a fine and beneficial thing to be doing, and I had the sense that it was the personal self wanting their consumption. It's always the real you that's on the real side, with the personal self along for the ride. Sometimes the real self can be fully in charge of the situation, and things go smoothly, as the real self always knows what to do in any situation or circumstance. The personal self has a tendency to mess things up, and we must be cautious not to bring it to bear. A little like on the physical level, where if we remain objective and stand in the new nowness without thought or emotion, then that is the real awareness, and we can deal with experiences most effectively. We better know what to do in each new moment. It is more exaggerated on the real side, that the degree to which we stand in our real awareness dictates the extent to which the experience unfolds in its smoothness of execution. Although everything is experience, some require the real self more so than the personal self, and the degree of personal self-involvement can completely alter the experience and make it less, to ultimately being a completely personal dream as an extension of itself. There can be the experience, and it can be presented in completely different ways, as the personal self can present as filters that won't allow perception of experience of a more expanded, beyond the created consciousness of itself nature. The personal self is literally standing in the way and obscuring the experience to the degree to which we align with it on the real side. The personal self wanted to consume the pills, but the real self did not. A kind of tug of war between that which makes sense in regards to becoming more aware and that which the personal self wants. Possibly then, these were idea attachments or agreements the personal self wished to hang on to literally digest into itself. The personal self will often justify its wants and desires by various means, convincing itself that it will be okay, etc. This was then made apparent as I put all the pill ideas into a glass of water, as though to dilute and water down the ideas. A personal self-compromise that, instead of keeping the ideas in their most potently restricting form, it would be okay if perhaps the ideas were kept, but in a lesser diluted form. Instead of drinking a can of Coke every day, just one every other day, as an example. Regardless of the compromise, it was as though the real self were still causing agitation with the personal self, that the ideas were best abandoned regardless of any compromise. The personal self was most dismayed and hurled the container of pills across the room. The personal self, though reluctant with these particular ideas, was on board with the process of awareness, it seemed, despite a little attitude. Always the task to get the personal self and the entirety of the 5 vehicles of itself focused on the real intent, the real awareness, that being to recognize and stand real with the ears. Perhaps if the personal self had been stubborn, the experience may not have continued on as it did, for if it consumed the ideas, and my awareness moved very much into the personal self and its wants and considerations, the experience may have proceeded as an extension of the personal self, a personal self-experience, and they are far more limited. At this point, though, I became fully lucid in the experience, and I have been doing this in recent times. Usually, the experiences just roll out like a movie. with me playing a role, and then I awake and put the experience together and do my best to recognize its demonstration. The real self on such experiences just does its thing, and then the personal self must figure out what's going on. Seems that the ability to become conscious in the experiences may be another step. Yes, the real self will still be dictating the adventures, but instead of just the personal self being dragged along and watching, a kind of merging between the personal self and real self is going on. In that, the real self is still executing the experience in the best possible real awareness way, but the personal self is a participant rather than an observer, and making conscious decisions within the parameters of the experience. Like on the physical level, where the idea is to stand in the new nowness, the being-isness state, and be in the best possible position to deal with situations due to the connection to the real awareness this standing allows. But the personal self isn't just asleep and taking a back seat. It is then dealing with the situations according to the real self is input it receives, because it is the personal self that must operate on the physical level while in creation, with the connection to the real awareness that allows a better decision to be made in each new moment. This had the same sense to it, rather than the real self just going about the experience. The personal self was there instead, but it wasn't a personal self-dream, as may have usually been the case. As the personal self, now on board with the focus and real intent of recognition of the ears, was doing what can be so on the physical, connected with the real awareness and receiving the best possible information in dealing with situations, and then the personal self decides. So a kind of collaborative intermingling between the two, as both selves, the real me and the personal little me, join forces with the same objective, and so the real side experience is executed no less effectively. but with the difference being it's more a conscious experience now, like a lucid dream. And so I would raise several feet off the ground and fly from my personal self that the house represented out into the street. I was even doing what I do if I happen to have an astral projection, as being fully conscious on the real side has it seeming far more real, and so, just like in an astral projection where you are equally as conscious, I will test that I'm not on the physical level by doing things you can't do on that level of life. My chosen test is to push my hand through solid objects, or what would represent as such on the physical, usually the floor, satisfied that I wasn't somehow awake and on the actual physical street. I proceeded and came across a van. Vehicles represent attitudes and aspects of the personal self, and I had a sense this was a personal self attitude. I was external to it, so I wasn't embodying this attitude or demonstrating it at this moment. There were 4 females standing there, all identical, and I would greet them. As they stood there, I opened the doors at the rear of the van and extracted the contents. There was a rifle, though requiring assembly, and 3 timepieces, 3 watches. The watches I distributed to the females, and had to search hard in the van to acquire the 4th watch that I knew was there, and when I did, I duly presented it to the 4th female. These 4 individuals were the 4 vehicles of my personal self, as was my impression, and I was giving them all watches as an indication that time was of the essence, that it was running out, and to get focused on the process of awareness. 3 watches were found straight away, and the 4th took a while to locate, suggesting one of the vehicles of the personal self was a little unfocused in the journey to the ears. We do need to get all the aspects of the personal self focused on the goal. the real intent, and I suspect it was the emotional self that was the one showing resistance, like an overspill from the first scene, with the want to keep the restricting to creation idea pillars. But despite that, when I secured the fourth watch, the emotional self accepted it agreeably enough. All the aspects of the personal self were then getting with the program, at least in this particular moment, and demonstrating their determination for the journey, and acknowledging the sense of urgency that the watches they accepted represented, and the van would be large enough for all of us. So an indication further of a journey the 5 vehicles were readily prepared to get on board with. I still had this dismantled gun that I couldn't put together, and then the actor Dolph Lundgren turned up. He took it from my hands, put the gun together, and showed me how to work it, then returned it to my keeping. The attitude that the van represented, that was external to me, an attitude I hadn't incorporated, was perhaps then one that was beneficial for the overall is recognition journey, and perhaps the experience that was soon to follow, an attitude of determination, grit and resolve, the kind of attitude James Bond or an action hero would require to complete their mission. And of course, Dolph Lundgren is one of these type actors, and indeed, he starred as He-Man back in the day, and so he did exemplify this kind of action hero trait. Even as I had the gun returned to me, I was reminded of a song. There's a bullet in your gun. There's a fire in your heart. You will move all mountains that stand in your path. So it was as though I was gathering my strength and embodying the sort of foot to the pedal, gunners a-blazing, action hero type attitude required for the journey.